The haunting tales of Dark Shivering. The village of Dark Shivering is shunned by two countries, England and Wales. It sits on the border, an unusual gem filled with stories of witchcraft and ghosts, the number of dead always outweighing the living, with plenty of stories to be told on a dark night. Bloodsucker. In 1968, Robert Hayward lived in a bungalow in Dark Shivering Woods. To one side was a deep forest of oak and fir trees, to the other was open fields that belonged to the property. The house and land had been owned by Robert's uncle, and when he passed away in 1965, his estate was left solely to Robert. Robert had spent his adult life living in Dark Shivering Village in one of the old council houses that lined the main street. The bungalow was far more secluded, and even though it had a long driveway, he could only drive his car part of the way up, as the last stretch of it before the bungalow was overgrown and unkept. It was only a walk of 400 yards or so, but in bad weather it felt a lot more. He intended to change this when he found the time. The bungalow had needed a lot of work done to it when he decided to move in. It needed a new kitchen and bathroom. The originals were barely a bucket and table to use. The roof needed repairing, and the list went on and on. His uncle had been a nice old chap, and there were many of his personal belongings still left around the house. Robert collected up a full box of religious items. He had crosses and statues of Jesus in every room, it seemed. The old chap must have been suffering memory problems worse than Robert had realized towards the end of his life, as he found notes written everywhere to remember to shut and lock the doors. He even had little metal plaques on each door reminding him to keep them closed too. Robert had retired early in 1967 and decided that being busy with a house and property in need of renovation was a good way of keeping his mind and body active and occupied. He certainly had been busy. After a day's work on the bungalow, he would go to bed at night exhausted, sometimes forgetting to eat until the rumble of his belly woke him the next morning. After the first 6 months, Robert had a lot of the renovation under control. The kitchen and bathrooms were clean and usable, the roof was repaired, and the chimney was cleaned ready for winter. Robert had begun chopping some of the wood on his property ready for the colder evenings. He already had a full coal bunker, but some of the trees needed removing as part of his landscaping plans. His main aim was to clear his driveway for better access. He didn't fancy wheelbarrowing next year's coal up the driveway again. He had made good progress in the couple of days he'd been out there working, but it was a bigger job than he'd first thought. There was rubbish dumped amongst the overgrowth, which all needed moving. There were old metal bed frames, car wheels, furniture, and even bicycles hidden deep under the thick hawthorn and gorse bushes. Robert was about to finish clearing up for another day. It was hard work, and he was defeated by it most days at lunchtime. But he knew every bit he cleared would help in the long run. He pulled his tools out from the piles of foliage, but as he did he heard a metal-on-metal sound. It seemed his spade had hit another piece of rubbish for Robert to move. He decided to have a look to see what he would be up against the following day. After pulling more bushes to the side, to his surprise he found an upright metal gate. It didn't look in too bad condition. Robert gave it a tug to see how stuck it might be. He managed to pull it towards him a bit, but there was too much undergrowth in the way to see what was there properly. It was definitely a job for another day. As he walked back towards his house, he heard the gate fall back into place behind him. That night Rob lay in his bed after a late supper. He knew it was long gone midnight, as earlier the static on his TV had jolted him awake as he nodded off in his armchair. In the distance he could hear a fox screaming, which wasn't unusual now he lived in such a rural area. The screaming seemed to go on forever until Robert decided to get up and have a look out of his window. Maybe some noise would scare the fox off, he thought. So he banged the window open noisily and had a look outside. It certainly seemed to work, as for the first time in over an hour there was silence outside. He was just about to shut the window and crawl back into bed when he heard another scream. It came from where he had been clearing the driveway earlier in the day. So he stared into the area, wondering if maybe he had upset the fox's home by pulling the trees and bushes about. Suddenly he heard the noise again, but this time he saw something moving. He couldn't quite work out what he was looking at, but the noise was coming from it. Robert tried to look harder at it, trying to work out its shape, but he started to feel nervous when he saw it was human-shaped. Even more worrying was it was heading towards the bungalow. Robert didn't mind admitting he was quite frightened at this point, and so decided to pull the curtains closed in case this odd person decided to look in through the window. He was panicking a bit as he knew the person would be somewhere near his window by now. But all was silent. He couldn't hear anyone walking on the stones outside, and there was no screaming to be heard. After so long, Robert began to wonder if he'd imagined what he'd seen. He wanted to look outside again to make sure there was no prowler waiting to break in. He nervously opened the curtain, but there was nothing there. Following an exhausting night, Robert still managed to get up the next morning ready for another day's work on his land. He took his wheelbarrow back down to the driveway and again began hacking away at the overgrowth. It didn't take long for him to come across the old gate he'd found the day before, and it reminded him of the fox screaming incident in the early hours of the morning coming from here. He cleared around the gate, and to his surprise found that it was actually attached to a rock behind it. It all seemed rather odd to Robert, but he kept clearing his way through to the gate until finally he could see what he'd found. The gate was attached at its hinges to some rock formation to the side of his driveway. To Robert it looked like someone had put a gate up on an entrance to some sort of cave or hole in the rock. Many times he'd visited his uncle at the bungalow and he'd never noticed this cave before, and his uncle had never mentioned it either. Beyond the gate was darkness and freezing cold air. There was nothing he could do at the moment to investigate as he didn't have a torch with him. So he carried on removing the rubbish while the gate slowly swung open as it came free from the year's worth of undergrowth. As he was shoveling the last of the dirt into the wheelbarrow, he saw a thin piece of metal poking out, so he pulled it free and saw it had writing on it. It looked as though it had been a part of the gate at some point. He rubbed it with his glove to see if he could read the words. Danger. Keep out. Do not unlock this gate without the express permission of the landowner. This gate is to be kept locked at all times. No admittance. Trespassers will be prosecuted. As Robert read the sign, he could see the gate swinging wide open in the breeze, mocking him, and a shudder went up his spine. Having had enough outside for one day, Robert decided to go back to the bungalow, clean up and get something sturdy to shut the gate back up with. But as time rolled on and he'd had a wash and eaten his dinner, he'd soon forgotten about the gate swinging open outside. That was, until he jumped awake in his chair later in the evening. That bloody fox is screaming again, he thought to himself. This time, however, it was really loud. It must have been right outside his door. He didn't fancy much trying to shoo it away, but he couldn't put up with another night of no sleep either. Robert jumped out of his chair and went to his front door. Hopefully, just opening the door would scare the fox off, thought Robert. He pulled the door open quickly to frighten it, but there was nothing there. As he looked out, he heard movement to the side of his house. And so he marched towards it noisily in an effort to move the fox on. He got to the corner of his front wall and again he saw movement sweep around the back of his property. And so he marched on. Chasing a fox in circles around his house was not what he had in mind before bed. But he really didn't want to be kept awake all night again. He sped up his footsteps in an effort to catch the fox in action. But again it was too elusive and had made the next corner before he could catch sight of it. Finally he was back to square one. His front door was still open with the hallway light streaming out into the pitch dark. He walked across the front of the house, annoyed at the wild fox chase he'd just been on when he spotted more movement by his front door. Of course, the wily old fox had smelt his supper and was probably trying its luck for some leftovers. Robert rushed to the door and looked in. All was quiet. All was calm. There was no fox running through his kitchen or sniffing at his plate. In fact, everything was eerily silent. Utterly flabbergasted with sheer frustration, Robert turned off all the lights and took himself off to bed. That night he didn't sleep well. He tossed and turned all night with awful nightmares of a humanoid creature curled up at the end of his bed. It was skinny with deathly pale skin all over its body. The thing was constantly unsettled, and would scream like the fox Robert had heard outside. Every once in a while, it would climb up the bed towards Robert, and bite hungrily at his jugular. Robert expected to wake up in these moments of terror just like he had as a child. Always waking up before you actually died. But this nightmare was never ending. After each bite, the creature would wrap itself back up at the end of the bed. Like a pet dog. When morning came, and Robert had managed to awaken from his ongoing nightmare, he could barely move. He felt as though all his energy had been taken. It was an effort just to get out of bed. He was soaked with sweat and looked as gray as a corpse. Robert knew something very unusual was happening as he dragged himself around the house trying to get ready for the day. There was a quiet loneliness that not even the radio or TV could penetrate. Although completely exhausted, he knew his first job would be to go back down his driveway to the gate and make sure it was closed and locked sturdily. He didn't care what animal he'd disturbed. He thought it best to just put things back as they were. He grabbed some old chain and the lock from his garage and headed down the path. Once at the gate he couldn't help but look deeper into the darkness behind it. As he scoped the area he could see it was a natural rock formation that looked to be about 12 feet deep. Spine-chillingly Robert thought he could see a pair of eyes blinking at him. Until it all turned dark again. Quickly, Robert wrapped the chain around the gate and post, and clicked the lock into place. He hurried back to the house and decided it was probably best to slow down for the rest of the day. One day off from working wouldn't hurt. The day didn't get any better, however, and Rob fell in and out of sleep whilst watching television in his lounge. He kept a blanket over him as it seemed unseasonably cold in the bungalow. His thoughts were drawn to all the signs and notes that his uncle had hanging around the house. Remember to lock the door. Don't leave the door open. An open door is an invitation to parasites. Keep this door closed. Maybe his uncle wasn't trying to keep the heat in, after all. Maybe he was trying to keep this ungodly cold out. When Robert awoke later in the day, he felt very sure that he needed to find one of his uncle's old crucifixes and put one back up in the house. He wasn't religious himself, but something was telling him to do it. Maybe it would just ease his mind. So he put his boots back on and trundled out to the garage to see what he could find. It didn't take long to find the box of religious ornaments his uncle had kept all over the house. And so Robert grabbed 2 large crucifixes and headed back inside. Within minutes, the front door and the back door both had crosses fixed to their side walls. And Robert felt much more at ease as the night drew closer. Robert went off to sleep easily enough that night, but at about 3 a.m. he began to have the same awful nightmare about the humanoid creature again being on his bed. This time screaming wildly and pacing back and forth. It darted up and down the bed and then up and down the walls. It seemed like a trapped animal. As the creature jumped off the bed, Robert took his chance to awaken himself properly. He kicked his legs around until finally he was wide awake and could move his body. He sat up, but to his horror he could still hear this thing dashing about the bungalow, running along the walls and ceilings. In terror he plucked up the courage to run from his room and confront this monster. And as he switched the hallway light on, he saw the creature gliding between the front and back door. Almost like it didn't know where to go. It stuck, Robert thought, between the 2 crucifixes he'd hung up earlier. In a blind panic he ran to open the front door and escape, but as he did, this thing swooped past him and headed down his driveway. Without hesitating, he ran back in the house and locked the door behind him. He was sweating with fear. He didn't want to admit to himself that this wasn't a dream and that he was fully awake. He slumped quickly in his chair. His mind was racing. There was no point denying to himself what he had just witnessed. He'd seen all the late-night horror films when he was young. And this creature was definitely a vampire. A vampire with fangs the size of tusks. Robert never heard anything or saw anything unusual around his property again. Where this vampire disappeared to, he had no clue. Only a few short months after chaining the gate back up, the rocks of the cave had fallen in, and so the cave was no more. A peaceful retirement ensued for Robert after this. The only thing was all those damn screaming foxes. The haunted campground. Dark Shivering Campground now lies as an abandoned piece of land, where once there was a thriving business and many happy memories for children to be made. The ground is a mile into the woods, but the only traffic the track sees now is dog walkers, walking their dogs. Back in its heyday, there were 6 long prefabricated buildings set around a well-maintained field. 2 buildings on the right were the girls' dormitory, and the 2 on the left were the boys'. The field in the center was used for ball games in the summer. And in the very center was a fire pit that the children had to avoid whilst playing football. Someone had painted the prefab dorm rooms outside walls to resemble log cabins, which as a child looked amazing, but if you visit now you can see the remnants of some badly painted faux cabins. There was an ice cream fridge by the main hut that was full of raspberry ripple ice cream and apple cider lollies. In the 60s, 70s and 80s saw the campsite's most popular days. School children would turn up every week on a coach to enjoy the countryside. It was an affordable way for children who lived in cities and towns to experience the great outdoors. It was an idyllic setting in the height of a warm summer. But in winter and at night it wasn't such a friendly place. Even the ice cream fridge seemed to make odd noises at night. As is usual at these kinds of places, children would tell each other ghost stories and begin to say they'd seen a ghost on the campground. No one really took much notice until a new camp leader, John Hawkins, took over in 1971. He was a natural information gatherer. And so 10 years later, there was a whole shelf of books in his office describing ghostly encounters reported to him by children, staff and teachers. In the summer, John had 3 helpers who would assist in the day-to-day running of the camp. In the winter it was just himself and the couple who owned the campground. The wife would do the cooking and cleaning every day, whilst the husband turned his hand to anything. The couple had a house tucked away just beyond the camping ground. And John had a large room in the back of the main hut, behind his office. The ghostly incident books John kept were fascinating, and ranged from small bits of information like, small blonde girl insisted she saw a man outside the dormitory window, and the doorknob started rattling. The girl hid under the covers, to more elaborate stories covering a week's worth of ghostly events experienced by the visitors. One notable event from the summer of '75 was a particularly creepy tale. It actually began in 1967 when the camp owner's dog had died. Being a beloved and much-missed pet, the owner and his wife had their dog Barney buried in his favorite spot with a stone marker. Barney 1953 to 1967. It didn't take long for the children to find the marker and presume it to belong to some long-dead child who was killed at the camp in a horrific way. The children would dare each other at the stroke of midnight to run from their dorm rooms over to Barney's grave where they had to say a rhyme. Barney, Barney, you can't catch me, you are dead, under the tree. Then they had to count up to a minute, and finish with another rhyme. Chase me, until I get to bed. Catch me, then I will be dead. Inevitably the children would come screaming and running from the tree line over to the dorm rooms, waking some angry teachers up in the process. But in 1975, one brave boy had decided to do the midnight dare on his own, whilst his friends watched eagerly from their dorm room windows. The boy stood by Barney's grave alone, and began reciting the rhyme. He was feeling okay until he'd counted up to 60. He heard something moving in the trees behind him, and quickly started on the second rhyme. He was keen to start running as he could still hear something behind him in the woods. Just as the boy started running back towards the dorm, he felt as if something was chasing him from behind. The boys in the dorm began shouting at him to hurry up. He could hear panic in their voices, but he dare not turn around. He just kept running. As he approached the dormitory, the boys began screaming and moving back into the room, when finally one of the children shut and locked the door in sheer terror. Leaving the boy outside on his own, he smashed into the door and began kicking and screaming at them to let him in. But they were all hidden under their beds, too terrified to move. The boy felt like wetting himself. He turned around to face whatever was chasing him. Behind him, floating 4 feet off the ground, was a hooded figure. It growled loudly and came towards the boy. To his horror, the ghoul came up close to his face and began sniffing him as though it was a dog trying to understand what it was looking at. Suddenly, the thing stopped and shot back off towards the woods. Then the boy fainted. This incident was witnessed by 12 children and a teacher. John Hawkins had his own ghostly encounters, which seemed to always pick up pace in the winter, when the campsite was quiet and rarely housed schools of children. 1978 was a particularly cold and bleak winter for John. In fact, the whole of the country was in a deep freeze, and saw spells of snow that closed parts of Britain down. The campsite was no different. The owners were staying in London with their daughter, and John was alone from November 1978 until February 1979. He had his radio to listen to, plenty of food in storage, and could always find jobs to be done around the campsite. One night he was in his room tidying up after dinner. He listened to the radio as snow covered the campground. It was already 4 inches deep outside his door, with no sign of stopping. Completely shattering his peace was a loud knock at the door. This was very out of the ordinary, but maybe someone had walked off the public path and needed help, he thought. John headed to the front door and opened it, expecting to find a lost rambler. Instead, he was faced with silent snowfall. He called out, but there was no reply. Everywhere was white and silent. John didn't quite know what to think. He looked at the ground and could see no footprints anywhere, in any direction. A chill ran up his spine. Maybe he imagined it, he thought. With nothing to see, he closed the hut back up and carried on with his evening. Later, as he sat reading a book and nodding off, his radio suddenly turned to static. As he looked up, through the window he saw a large hooded figure glide past. He jumped up and went to the window to see what it was. And in the snowy silence he saw a dark shrouded figure glide out across the campground and head into the forest. John was scared, but also stuck in the middle of the woods in a snowstorm. There would be no help coming. A regular occurrence in the books was from the girls' dorm room. They would be awoken in the night by the showers starting up in the bathroom. After investigating and finding no one there, the girls would go back to bed, only to be awoken later by an old woman leaving the bathroom and walking out of the main door. This was the normal routine for this particular ghost, except for one time that she interacted with one of the girls in bed. The shower had come on as usual, and woken some of the girls up. They checked in the bathroom and found no reason for the shower to be on, and so went back to bed. One of the girls couldn't get back off to sleep, and so sat up in her bed reading a book by torchlight. Suddenly, the old woman came out from the bathroom, startling the little girl as she lay in her bed. The girl watched as the old woman came down the center of the dorm and headed for the door. Just as she was going to leave the room, she turned as if she'd just noticed the torchlight on, and slowly moved back towards the little girl's bed. She looked at the girl and headed towards her. The girl stared in horror as the woman stopped at the end of her bed. The woman's face was old and haggard. She looked at the little girl, and raised her finger to her lips and made a shushing noise. Then turned back to the door and left before the little girl started screaming. The campground fell into disrepair and closed in the early 90s. I was kindly given the collection of ghost books that John Hawkins had meticulously kept over the years. A haunting on Boxbush Road. In 1973, Susan was 10 years old and living in a terraced house on Boxbush Road. She was an only child and she lived there with her mum and dad. The houses along both sides of the street were all the same except for the one Susan's family and their neighbor lived in. Joining their two houses together was an archway, and the archway led to both back gardens, a luxury none of the other houses had. The family had lived there since Susan was born in 1963, but by 1973, Susan's mother Doreen had begun to suffer with some debilitating mental health problems, and had become anorexic. Doreen was a stay-at-home mother, as was the norm in those days, whilst her husband worked for the family cleaning business. He worked long hours and would be out of the house every morning by 5 a.m. This seemed to be where the problems started. Previous to working for the family business, Susan's father, Ron, worked in a local factory. His hours were much shorter then, with a start time of 8 a.m. When Susan told me about her childhood experiences, she told me that her mother's mental health problems had been caused by paranormal activity in their house. It had begun innocently enough when Don started leaving the house earlier in the mornings. Susan would lay in their bed having been awoken by her husband leaving. She started to hear the attic door opening by itself every morning. The old terraced house was an odd design. It had 2 bedrooms upstairs, but you had to walk through the first bedroom to get to the second. The first bedroom that you walked through was Susan's room, and in that room was a door that led up to the attic. The door was only 5 foot high and it was always kept closed to keep the heat in the bedroom. The attic was old and dirty. The family only used it for storing their Christmas decorations and some old furniture. Just as many children wouldn't like an attic door in their bedroom, Susan was no different. She sometimes thought it opened in the night when she was trying to get to sleep. She would hide under the duvet until sleep took over. Doreen found the attic door opening more of an annoyance at first. She thought maybe it pulled open when her husband slammed the downstairs door shut and the draft was pushing it open. It would start creaking back and forth as the draft blew through and kept her awake unless she went to close it. Progressively the door creaking annoyed Doreen so much she had her husband fit a new lock onto it so it would not keep blowing back open. This worked for about a week and then Doreen's nightmare really started. One morning after her husband had just left for work, she couldn't believe her ears when she heard the familiar creak of the attic door. She lay there irritated that the door had somehow come open again. This time, however, the creaking was followed by loud footsteps. Doreen lay in her bed listening intently to the noises, thinking maybe Susan had gotten out of bed to come and see her. She waited for her to come into the room. But it wasn't Susan who came into her bedroom, it was a man. The man was old and shuffling towards her bed. Doreen was terrified and frozen in fear. As she stared in horror, the old man jumped on the bed and began to throttle her. Try as she might, Doreen could not move. The man's hands were tight around her neck, but as Doreen stared up at him she could see he was translucent, and she could see the whole room through him. Doreen passed out. When she next awoke, she didn't know if it had been the worst nightmare of her life or real. Her question was answered 3 days later when the same thing happened to her again. Her nerves were shot to pieces, and her husband didn't know what to do. When he was there, nothing like this ever occurred. After weeks of this recurring attack, Doreen decided to speak to Susan about it. She couldn't believe this was really happening to her without her daughter hearing or seeing anything. And she was right. Susan hadn't wanted to say anything to her mum as her mum was suffering enough with her own issues, but Susan had been having paranormal activity in her bedroom too. She told her mum that some mornings she would hear the attic door open and an old man would come into her room. He would walk around her bed and head into her mother's room. That's all she ever saw of the man, but after he had gone into the other bedroom. Susan would see lots of little devil-type creatures at the bottom of her bed. They were demonic looking and seemed to be making sure Susan didn't move as they crawled, climbed and rolled all over the end of the bed. Susan would pull the covers over her head and hide until it was time to get up for school. Doreen was horrified. If Susan had been seeing the same man in the mornings, then it couldn't be in her mind. It must have been an evil entity. Doreen spent some time in a psychiatric hospital after these events began. She needed help with her eating disorder and nervous disposition. Whilst she was away, there was never any activity in the house. One day, as Doreen was recuperating at home, she was hanging the washing on the line in the garden and her neighbor chatted away to her whilst tending to her vegetable patch. As the women conversed, Doreen offered her neighbor to come in for a cuppa, and so the two women headed for the house. As they sat in the kitchen talking about their children and families, her neighbor mentioned that she used to be in Doreen's house all the time when the previous family lived there. They were the Buffon family and she was good friends with them at the time. She went on to say, Mrs. Buffon used to hold seances in the kitchen whilst her husband was at work. Being a Christian herself, Doreen was quite horrified at the thought of seances being held in her house. But the neighbor went on to say that Mrs. Buffon would contact the dead around the kitchen table with friends and neighbors for years. She also took to using a Ouija board too. Doreen couldn't believe her ears, and she asked her neighbor what happened to the Buffons before she moved there. The neighbor told her that Mr. Buffon had strangled his wife in the bedroom and gone on to hang himself in the attic. No one knew the reason why. It was just a tragic event which left their son, John Buffon, mother and fatherless in his 30s. Doreen asked the neighbor if she had a photo of him, but the only thing the neighbor had was the newspaper article of the murder-suicide. There was a black and white photo of the family, and Doreen could plainly see that Mr. Buffon was the old man that was attacking her in her bedroom. Doreen was sent back into Coney Hills Psychiatric Hospital shortly after this. Whilst she was recovering in the asylum, her husband moved the family to another property a couple of miles from the old house. Doreen never had to endure any more paranormal attacks after moving house. She and her husband are still alive today, and still live in the house they moved to from Boxbush Road. Doreen still follows her Christian faith to ward off any evil parasites or entities. And her mental health and eating disorder are all under control. If you are a paranut like me, please consider subscribing to my channel. There are plenty more ghostly tales to share, and you don't want to miss them. From imps to demons, vampires to ghosts and dogmen to poltergeists. Dark Shivering has them all.